I've got a quick question for you before we get started today. Were there any outstanding presentations at the last Master Brewers district meeting you attended? I bet there were. Well, we'd like to share those stories with listeners, but we need your help. Unless they attended that same district meeting, Master Brewers members, including me, will never know about these outstanding presentations unless they get uploaded to the Master Brewers District Presentations Archive. So next time you sit in on a really great presentation, ask your district officers if you can help them get the presentations uploaded. It's super easy. There's even a short how-to video link at the top of the archive. And if there's a presentation that you think we should highlight here on the show, shoot me a quick message. You can find me at community.mbaa.com. This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
There's like one ingredient that brewers are using less and less of, and this is ingredient in a brewery, which is a calendar.
This week on the show, we get a glimpse at life inside a brewer's yeast supply lab. You'll hear about tips for ordering yeast, how to better align expectations with reality, and of course, when to blame the maltster.
Hi, my name is Jasper Akerboom, and I'm with Jasper Yeast.
Hi, my name is Travis Tedrow, and I'm with Jasper Yeast.
What details would you like the customer to provide when they're placing an order?
What we want to hear is basically as much as possible. What kind of beer are they going to brew? What are their expectations? And then we like to hear more than just starting gravity, final gravity. But those obviously are very important, as well. That is like, because people have a certain expectation, and they think, not everybody, but, when people pitch yeast, they would like to come in, like to the beer to become something they have in their head. And since brewing nowadays is a lot of different styles, a lot of one and dones, so people don't really have the time to get to know a specific strain very well. We need to kind of do that work for the brewer a little bit, and we gladly do that. But then we need to know a lot of information. How is their oxygenation set up? How much LPMs and ppms are we talking about? What's the temperature that they cast out at? What do they set the tank at? How much time do they give it? This is so basically as much as possible.
All right. You just mentioned that many brewers are doing one and done batches, especially with all the hazy IPAs that are getting dry hopped during fermentation. Also, a lot of those beers tend to have pretty high starting gravities. What would you advise to a brewer that's decided to brew a big beer on that first fermentation cycle?
I mean,
First, we say try and reconsider, and if there's no other option, we try to make it realistic and share the pitfalls of making that the goal. One thing that I've always used with great success and that we share is consider, even when you're using a full-size pitch, for a Gen 1, if it's going to be a high gravity, think about timing another batch of beer, hopefully a lighter wort, nothing particularly heavily hopped, that you can prop that up. It's odd to think about propping a full-size pitch, but if you're talking about a 18-plus Play-Doh, that only benefits you, whether it's shaving off time or making that attenuation a reality. What you set out on your spreadsheet, making that actually possible.
Yeah, as and to add to what Travis is saying, a lot of guys, because they're one and done beers, they are feeling the expense of the purchasing of the yeast. And obviously we understand that, and we want to help with that as well. And then that's kind of that's why that story comes into play too.
Okay, let's talk more about financial implications. You guys have said that liquid yeast is a better deal than purchasing bricks of dry yeast. Talk about that.
So when you think about dry yeast, obviously, the initial purchase might be cheaper. But, we advise against reusing a dry yeast pitch. There are advantages to using dry yeast, but more on the side of it can handle like a storage that is like not as cold as what liquid yeast can handle. The cells are in a worse state, but that state doesn't get worse as it is. And liquid yeast can obviously, if you leave that out at room temperature for 2 days, that's going to be very, very bad. But the great thing with liquid yeast is that you can, if you plan your batches well, you stress cleanliness and general yeast health in your brewery, that you can reuse this pitch several times. And if by doing so, you can kind of smear out the cost of this liquid pitch over all these batches, and it's going to be much, much cheaper. You get to know this strain much better. And it's just in better shape. The cells are in better shape when you use liquid yeast. There's no doubt about it.
And one thing I wanted to add to what Jasper just mentioned is you asked what's the difference in customers and working with brewers today as opposed to maybe a few years ago. Personally, when I started brewing and started learning about yeast and how to operate it, you used Gen 1 yeast so that you could get to Gen 2, 3, and 4. That was the sweet spot. That was the goal, is to, if Gen 1 for whatever reason was a little slower, ultimately it's, in some person's eyes, a slightly smaller pitch than what you might normally pitch later generations. You were trying to, in some sense, use that first gen to have a successful batch so that you could get to Gen 2, 3, 4, and beyond with fantastic harvests, as much yeast as you wanted. And now with people using yeast for just one generation, there's no experience with the benefits of spreading the yeast out. You not only save, but you're also getting faster fermentation times. There's numerous benefits outside of defraying the cost over numerous batches. There's just much more successful fermentations with those later generations with properly maintained yeast.
Yeah. And it is kind of there's like one ingredient that I feel, that we both feel, that brewers are using less and less of, and this is ingredient in a brewery, which is a calendar. Sounds kind of crazy, but you need to plan. You need to plan well. If you plan well, then you can do these kind of things. And it's obviously the market puts tremendous pressure on breweries nowadays to innovate, come up with different beers very quickly. But that old school planning ahead of time, thinking 3 batches away what this yeast is going to go into. I feel like it's a little less prevalent that people are thinking about those kind of things than it was in the past.
Let's talk about ordering yeast for Belgian beers. I've watched a lot of brewers, self-included, make mistakes here. What are some things that brewers should keep in mind when planning Belgian yeast fermentations?
In my experience, I think I fall into the same group, John, of learning about Belgian beers, unfortunately, through less successful fermentations and not really knowing exactly what to expect. I think it's one, there's the added element in certain styles, and particularly Belgian, since they're often yeast-driven flavors for certain styles. There's certain instances where you might want to adjust the pitch rate and pitch a little less than normal. There's also a number of Belgian styles where people are adding candied sugar, syrups, things like that, and the timing, appropriately addressing when to add those simple sugars to prevent any yeast stall is very important. We do a lot of talks about that, just trying to help people out.
In general, and this is obviously in general speaking, this is not the case for all Belgian strains, but in general, Belgian strains are a little bit of I don't know how to say this, like a little bit less domesticated. So what you'll find is that the carbohydrate metabolism is a little tight. The regulation is a little tighter. So you'll get the famous shoulders in your fermentation, or the stalling when the strain runs out of specific sugars and it needs to switch to more complicated carbohydrates. And these strains also have the tendency to not like it to be controlled by the brewer temperature-wise. So if you're fermenting a specific beer and you're halfway through, just keep your hands off the temperature control and let the yeast do its job. And if you start cooling the strain, a lot of the famous Belgian strains that a lot of people use will just stop fermenting, and it's almost impossible to get them going again. And this is something that for brewers is sometimes hard to understand. And so you need to really plan well where you're starting, and what temperature you're starting, how many cells you put in, the oxygen levels. And this could be different for several strains, so you really need to know what you're doing. And the one beer that most people call us about and have issues about is the Belgian style triple. It's a beer that contains a lot of simple sugars. So, like Travis already said, when to add those can have a big effect on your attenuation. But also, a lot of breweries do not have the proper equipment capacity to do a step mash, and step mashing is very common to reach that specific attenuation levels that are quite high, to get this nice dry high ABV beer. And if that's difficult for you, then then you have to kind of keep that in mind, and don't expect, if you don't do the proper steps before and you pitch the yeast, that you're going to get a beer that with the dryness you desire, so to speak. So setting the right expectations is also very important.
All right, let's continue talking about sort of troubleshooting problematic fermentations. What do you typically advise brewers to do when they're dealing with a stuck fermentation?
When someone calls with an issue like that, we have to go back to, if we missed the conversation at the time of someone ordering yeast, all the questions that we should have discussed and talked about then, you kind of have to go backwards and backtrack and hear the story of the recipe, what you did. And at that point, at least for us, it's trying to do a little consulting work without being on site, which is pretty challenging. And there's no perfect method for that. But we're asking about, we're asking, like Jesper said, about oxygenation. We're asking about yeast storage, yeast health. Where was it? How did you pitch? What type of lag time did you experience? What timeline? How far into the brew are we, or the fermentation process? So we're starting with those questions, and depending on the yeast, depending on what it is, we would recommend a number of things. If it's really, really early into a batch of beer, there might be an opportunity to re-aerate, or there might be a discussion about harvesting yeast. They might need to reprop a portion of that yeast and resuspend it. Sometimes it's just a matter of resuspending the yeast in that beer. It might be as easy as let's turn the glycol off, or something like that, especially with those Belgian strains. So I feel the sooner that you can address an issue, the easier it is to fix it. And outside of a beer that's truly contaminated, I am behind the belief that you can fix almost every beer or make it hopefully very close to your expectations, as long as you have clean practices and you can you have accurate information that you outline with notes. That helps. Things like pH. That's all very important. So there's many ways to fix something, or at least to address it and figure out what went wrong, so that you can correct it for future batches as well.
Yeah, and if I might jump into that as well, is the first thing people often think is, hey, fermentation is prematurely ending. It must be the yeast, and this is not always the case. It could well be that there's something wrong, for example, with your grain, or that if a temperature probe is off, you're mashing in way too cold or too warm. There's there could well be those kind of things happening. So we also advise people to do a forced fermentation, which is really easy to do, just to make sure that the wort you're actually having in hand is actually fermentable all the way to what you want. When I was working at a production brewery, and we ran into an issue that our ales were finishing a little, like I would say, a degree Plato higher than we wanted, and everybody pointed fingers at the yeast, and we looked what happened, and we got a new silofill when it started. And we looked at the numbers that were given to us by the malt company, and they obviously were, they couldn't be right. And then what we did is we added, we were lucky that we had the equipment to do a step mash, and we added a 162 rest for 5 minutes, and the problem went away. So this is also something that might be a reason. So people should think further than just the yeast.
Yeah, just don't blame the yeast every time.
That's right.
Some of the times. All right, you gotta blame the maltster every now and then too. They get lonely if you don't do that. Coming up,
optimal situations, like laboratory situations, are not what's happening in a brewery.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Bring the world to your brewhouse with BSG's diverse selection of ingredients and services. Our dedicated customer service team and industry experience provides you with the assistance you need every step of the way. Make BSG your supplier of choice with products essential to making great artisanal beverages so you can stay focused on your craft. Visit us at bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact us at 1-800-374-2739.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District Western New York meets at Resurgence Brewing Company in Buffalo December 10th. District St. Louis meets January 16th. District Pittsburgh meets in Emsworth January 18th. District New England meets in Merrimack January 24th and 5th. The Ontario Technical Conference is January 29th to the 31st in Kingston. District St. Louis meets February 20th. District Northern California holds its technical conference February 27th and 28th in Sonoma County. One of our newest districts, District Great Plains, meets February 28th and 29th in Kansas City. Check out the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. All right. Well, you mentioned some of the things that you get the most calls about, especially with those strong Belgian beers. Any other common problems you hear you get called a lot about from brewers?
I would say, and this is maybe something you can take better than me, Travis, because of your professional experience too. But it's lager brewing. You know, it's kind of an art that is it's more complicated than people think.
Yeah, I as far as trends and things that I've noticed, and I think Jasper has as well. I've noticed a number of craft breweries and former ale breweries getting into the lager game, which we fully support. I think it's fantastic. I love multi-lagers. I like hoppier lagers. I think it's great, but there is certainly a information gap on at least how to start that process. And certain strains are obviously need to be overpitched compared to what you're doing with ales. Most of them, there's lots of, hey, this is incredibly slow. As technical as the bubbles aren't nearly as fast as when I'm brewing an ale. So we have to explain that, and talk about the numbers, things like that. There's, aeration, obviously at cooler temperatures, you're getting more dissolved oxygen as you're casting out. There is too cold for lager yeast in order to get yeast to actually start. It still needs to be in suspension. You still need yeast to be touching those sugars for it to ferment and consume those sugars. So we spend a lot of time talking about getting lager fermentation started. But we talk a lot about aeration techniques, and as far as saving on a purchase of yeast, we have recommended, you're casting out at let's say 2 p.m., 10 p.m., there's instances where you need to re-aerate, and you can, grow more yeast, and you can have a much more successful lager fermentation. How to get that oxygen dissolved into that beer, sometimes just blowing it through is not going to get the absorption versus other techniques, whether it's putting a little head pressure on the tank to keep more of that oxygen in suspension, or maybe there's an opportunity to recirculate. But yeah, I think answering some of those questions and sharing how lager fermentation is different from ale, at least at the first 48 hours until you have a strong, high Krausen fermentation going, is very different, and it takes some getting used to. You have to get used to that slow, consistent bubbling in your blow-off bucket.
I've never liked the term pitchable, which unfortunately seems to have become mainstream brewer vocabulary, because generally I want to know how many cells a supplier is actually sending me. Your website has a page that gives pitch rate ranges for different types of yeast at various temperatures and then translates that into a pitchable quantity. How about walking us through a few examples?
Yeah, obviously, when we look at the pitching rates, it's we kind of try to speak the language that the brewer speaks, and we get you can the questions we get when we talk to people, we can kind of hear whom they've been buying from, and people talk about liters of slurry, and then those kind of terms. It's like we like to talk about number of cells, like you do. And obviously about, we want to know the amount of sugar that's going to be in their wort, the degrees of Plato. And we use as a starting point, basically a lighter ale using like an English or an American ale kind of beer, say until 14 Plato. And then we kind of say aim for about 7.5 million cells per mil. Now, if you are going to higher gravity, you need more cells. So we have like a specific formula that we use, and then you end up at a higher cell count. Say between 14 and 19 degree Plato, we would advise to use, say, 12 million cells per mil. So it's about 1.6 times the amount of cells needed. If you go above 20, then we advise to use at least 18 million cells per mil. And obviously, these are there's no one thing fits all, but it's kind of how we approach it, because we cannot put pitch rates for every single strain on there. But if you use this kind of method, then you can kind of get where you go. And then it's also on our website we also talk about lagers. Lagers, you need a higher cell count. It's using 1.3 million cells per degree Plato for lagers. And then if you start it even colder, then we would advise to use more again. And this is also for people to understand that if they use a Gen 1 pitch, and they say, and we've talked to brewers that said, we want to start our lager at 46 degree Fahrenheit, and we want that to be ripping the next day, and it's going to be 18 degree Plato starting gravity. It's going to be kind of a shell shock for them to hear how many cells they need, and they don't expect that they have to spend that much money. But you need a ton of cells if you want to do that. So that's why we also, like Travis already mentioned, want to help them approach this differently. And this is especially the case for very flocculent lager strains. So this is kind of how we approach it. When you're talking about Belgians, basically the rule book goes out of the door. Then there's a lot of different different things to think about. Oxygen levels can be a lot lower. Often pitch rates are a lot lower.
One thing I want to add that kind of falls through the crack when it comes to working with yeast, whether it's Gen 1 or later generations, is very few breweries have a way of measuring how much dissolved oxygen they're getting into their beer. So, and many breweries have different varying amounts of time that it takes for them to cast out. And there's also, different lengths of hose from the kettle to your fermenter. So, there is certainly an instance where a brewery could pitch less yeast than another for a lager pitch and still have successful fermentation. And I'm certain part of that is because of different methods for actually getting that oxygen in suspension. A lot of people through trial and error experience, if say they're brewing 30 barrels of beer and it's a 15 barrel kettle, so they brew 15 barrels, double brew in one day. They have a much longer lag time than if they use that same pitch and brewed 15 barrels one day and then 15 barrels the next day. In part, they're getting a lot of good growth, and they're getting another opportunity to aerate that wort. There's also the hydrostatic pressure of that first batch that's already been growing yeast, that you're now likely getting a lot more dissolved oxygen just based on the weight of the first batch on top of that second batch is keeping a lot more of that oxygen in suspension. So that's another thing that I think people don't consider.
Yeah, I mean, like one thing is, as you can hear out of the answer from both Travis and me, is that we obviously are the microbiologists here, but we're also thinking as brewers. We've been we've been in the trenches, and we know that optimal situations, like laboratory situations, are not what's happening in the brewery. It's not optimal. And sometimes the things are because they are like they are, because that's the equipment you have at hand. And we want to work with everybody, all of the people that call us and ask for information, help, and yeast, help them get the best results with the equipment and knowledge and people they have. That's kind of where we come from.
Busy breweries that have a steady stream of wort can propagate smaller quantities of yeast. We've got another episode in the pipeline with Doug Hyman, who describes his self-proclaimed $700 hillbilly yeast propagator. I'm sure you give out a lot of advice on propagation plans. Every situation is unique, of course, but do you have any big picture do's or don'ts for brewers who want to propagate?
Well, obviously, everybody can do it, but it's not as easy as it sounds, because what we do, we have a lot of checks and balances in place. The quality control that you need during propagation, I would say, it needs to be much higher than quality control during fermentation. Not because obviously you want to have a good lab and test everything as well, but if you have like one cell in your propagation that comes in, it might be lurking in the background, but you'll see it in your fermentations. It's it's a big responsibility that you're taking up on your shoulders that we as a yeast lab, but also all the other labs are taken upon themselves. They do a lot of quality control like we do, and I'm sure that people who built a hillbilly rig propagator are not doing the same thing that we do. So obviously you're rolling the dice a little bit. That being said, I'm not saying that it's not impossible, but you have to keep that in mind.
Everybody says it, whether you're working in a lab or a brewery. If you're going to propagate, you need a microscope just to see, what you're actually growing. Find out if what you think you're stepping up is growing to the appropriate cell count for what you're expecting to pitch. Had you been pitching cone to cone, or if you had purchased a pitchable quantity, as you like to say, for that batch of beer. And whether or not that's going to assist the flavor of that beer. If you're going to be growing up a Belgian strain or something like that where it's yeast forward, there is a scenario where you could possibly overpitch and mute the flavors that was the sole purpose of brewing a Belgian style. So not to say that you couldn't dial that in with proper cell counting and saying, hey, you know what, we only need to prop it up with 1 barrel instead of 2, and we want to brew it within 24 hours after stepping that up, or maybe we want to let it go for a couple days, or maybe we want to re-aerate that propagation tank. I mean, there's a host of things to consider, and someone should treat it as a way to enhance the quality of the beer, not as a way to save money. I think a side effect of propping would be saving money, but it should be a way to make your beer even better. Should be the main focus if you're going to go down that road.
Let's talk about lead times. I'm sure the modern day Amazon Prime culture isn't doing you guys any favors. How much time do you really need from order to ship date, and is that period of time different for different strains?
I would say 2 weeks is what we need. If this is a strain that's, and this is for a strain that is, we have to start from scratch, which we grow a lot of yeast from scratch. But some of them we have basically in continuous production, so then the lead time might be a little less. But we want the yeast that we send out to be super healthy, ready to go, as fresh as possible. So that's why we are taking that approach. So it just needs some time, going from colony all the way to a 50-barrel pitchable. There's some time in there, and there is the quality control that we need to do as well. And we have PCR, we have plating, we have all kinds of other tests, and those just take time. So before we are 100% sure that it passes those quality control checks, we rather not send it out. So that's why we have that 2-week lead time, basically.
All right, sounds good. Let's say I order yeast from you. It shows up. It goes into the standard brewery cold room that's probably in the mid to upper 30s, and I have a delay in my brewery, so I can't brew the next day as I planned. How long do I have before it starts to deteriorate to the point that I need to either adjust my process or just not use it?
Our viability should be well within acceptable range for upwards of 2 weeks. But I would say if you're going to hold on to yeast more than 4 or 5 days, plan on feeding it with either work from a fresh batch or making a little starter to feed that. You're not doing yourself any favors by just letting it sit around. It doesn't increase in value by holding on to it. So yeah, it should be a concern, and that's a good question, because I think there's a lot of people that do a great job of setting out a long calendar, and they plan a bunch of things out, and so they might order yeast a month or 6 weeks in advance, and we have it on the calendar, and it ships out, and then things change. So if that's the case, we can advise on how to feed that yeast. But yeah, absolutely, I would say within 5 days you should seriously think about feeding it in some way to maintain the high viability.
That was Jasper Ackerboom and Travis Tedrow here on the Master Brewers Podcast. Jasper currently serves as president of District Mid-Atlantic, where he's uploaded his fair share of district presentations. And on that note, don't forget to ask your district officers if you can help them get those district presentations uploaded to the archive. And drop me a line if you think there's a presenter we should have on the show. All the links you need are in the show notes. Are you enjoying the Master Brewers podcast? Let me tell you about a simple way you can help us keep making more. Take a minute to thank our sponsors. There's no way we could produce this show without generous support from sponsors like Hopsteiner, ABS, Proximity Malt, and BSG. So please, let them know you heard their message on the Master Brewers podcast and that you appreciate their support.